Hello and welcome to Biblical Breadcrumbs. In this episode, we'll be in Matthew 26, verses 47 through 56. Matthew 26, 47 to 56. Yes, that is the right selection of verses. We're nearing the end now. In the book of Matthew, we've been through a whole lot with Jesus and all the rest of these characters that we're talking about. We've been through a lot of the story, and now here we are wrapping things up near the end. The climax is building and it's about to happen, and we're going to get right up to the cusp of it and even start into it in this episode, but we're not there quite yet. Matthew 26. We're nearing the end of the chapter, and we're nearing the end of several things, nearing the end of the book itself. Last time we were talking about the earlier portion of chapter 26. We were in verses 36 to 46, I believe, 31 to 46 even, where Jesus is predicting that the disciples are going to betray him, and all the disciples are very insistent. No, they're not going to betray him. They're not at all. They would never do something like that. That would be awful. They are going to stay faithful even though nobody else will. They're going to stay good even though nobody else will. They're going to be the good ones. Well, Jesus is going to say, no, you're not. You're faithless. You're leaving. You're the ones who are going to deny me the most. And that all comes to a head right here. After he's prayed, and the disciples couldn't even stay awake for that. Peter, James, and John, they were all sleeping. After he's prayed 3 times and corrected them a couple times, he ends off verse 46 saying, "Get up, let's go. See, my betrayer is near." And now in verse 47, the ending begins, if you want to think about it like that. Now in Matthew chapter 26, let's read this section starting in verse 47. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, suddenly arrived. A large mob with swords and clubs was with him from the chief priests and elders of the people. His betrayer had given them a sign, "The one I kiss, he's the one. Arrest him." So immediately he went up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. "Friend," Jesus asked him, "why have you come?" Then they came up, took hold of Jesus, and arrested him. At that moment, one of those with Jesus reached out his hand and drew his sword. He struck the high priest's servant and cut off his ear. Then Jesus told him, "Put your sword back in its place, because all who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I can't call on my Father? And he will provide me here and now with more than 12 legions of angels? How then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way?" At that time, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a criminal to capture me? Every day I used to sit teaching in the temple, and you didn't arrest me. But all this has happened so that the writings of the prophets would be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and ran away. The start of this story, the beginning part of this story, is where Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane looking down from the Mount of Olives, and he sees the doors opening, and he sees the mob coming out of Jerusalem. He's close enough by to be able to see that happening. And when he sees that happening, while he's speaking, he's saying, "Look, my betrayer, he's right there. This mob is coming for me. These people are gathering for me." And while he's even saying that, one of his friends comes up and betrays him. It's Judas. Judas, the one who back in verse 25 kind of declared his innocence or maybe questioned his guilt. And Jesus said, "No, yes, it's you. You know exactly what you're doing." Whatever that interaction was, Judas has decided to full-on betray Jesus. Even though Matthew seems to imply Judas is still there, even though Matthew implies Judas could come back, even though Judas has an opportunity to turn around, he doesn't. He doesn't. He's the one who suddenly arrives. He shows up with a mob, and you get this scene of betrayal that happens between Judas and his master, Jesus. Now, it's interesting how this betrayal is described, because you'll notice it is surprisingly intimate and rather respectful as well. It's very odd touches that Matthew adds into the text here. The betrayer had given them a sign, the one that I kiss, he's the one. I mean, okay, no matter what that kissing looks like, if you're kissing hand or cheek or whatever it is, if you're kissing someone, you're pretty close to them, right? You don't let an enemy come into your personal sphere. You don't let an enemy into your personal, like, 5 feet of space, do you? Right? You're going to resist that person, but if you're able to walk up and kiss them, that means you're pretty close. That means you're good friends at the very least. That means that you guys are friends or family or related in some way. Judas is using a sign of friendship and peace and closeness to betray, which is an odd thing. He calls Jesus rabbi, which means like respected teacher. He calls Jesus a teacher that he respects and a master that he listens to, but then he doesn't, and he betrays him. And so you get these weird, intimate and respectful touches to a story that really doesn't have any of that. And you get Jesus's response as well. It's in verse 50. It's right here. Friend, why did you do this? Why did you come? Jesus's friend has betrayed him. It's not like Judas is a guy he didn't care about. Did he know that Judas was going to betray him from the very beginning? I think he did. If he's God and he's talking with God, I think he did know. That doesn't mean he doesn't like him. That doesn't mean they're not friends. That doesn't mean they haven't been through a lot together. That doesn't mean they weren't good buddies all throughout this story. And yet here we are at the end of everything. And Jesus, who gave Judas, his friend, an opportunity to come back, an opportunity to not do evil, Jesus, who gave Judas, his friend, every opportunity, is betrayed by his friend. To which he says, why did you come? Do what you came to do, other translations say. This is what you're so intent on. I tried to tell you to stop. I tried to tell you to turn back. I tried to tell you not to do this. But this is what you're so intent on. Do what you came to do. And the betrayal happens. They took hold of Jesus and they arrest him in verse 50. And that's it. It's done. It's very simple, very quiet, and very sad process. Everything in these next couple of chapters, it happens quick. It's pretty brief. And the actual betrayal, the actual violence that happens is very quick. It's there and then it's gone. It's very quick and it's done. We're not lingering on the physical side of things, no. But we are going to talk about friends. We are going to talk about closeness. We are going to talk about betrayal of friend to friend. Because the real toll here is not just the physical. That one's obvious. The real toll here is the emotional, the mental, the spiritual, as a friend turns on Jesus and destroys all of the trust Jesus could have in him. The disciples said, we're not going to deny you. We're not going to betray you. We wouldn't do something like that. And yet here you have one of the disciples leading off and doing the worst possible version of a betrayal that could ever be done. Well, it's okay, right? Because in the next couple of verses, you have this resistance idea, this verses 51 through 54, as somebody who's with Jesus, he draws a sword and he goes and attacks a high priest's servant and he cuts off his ear for some reason, right? There are suggested theories about why the ear, I don't know, he just cuts off his ear, he misses. Or he aimed for that. He wasn't trying to kill him. Maybe he's just intimidating him. Maybe he's I don't know, he's convinced that Jesus needs a military solution to what looks like a military problem. He needs civic justice and civic defenses to the civic issue. And what does Jesus say? Stop it. Just stop. He says resistance is futile. But not from the words, not from the perspective of an enemy, but of a friend. Put your sword back If you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. It's not going to go well for you. Violence is not the answer here. If violence was the answer, just an aside to his disciples, if violence was the answer, don't you think I'd win? Right? Right? It's not that Jesus is condemning all violence as the answer for everything. He says, look, if the answer was to have an insurrection, I would win that because I have God and I have angels and y'all don't. Sorry. Right? It's not that violence is not the answer ever, it's that violence is not the answer here. Why? Why not? Why can they not protect him? They're supposed to not betray him, right? They're supposed to do everything they can to stand up for him, and yet Jesus here says basically, stop it. I could win this fight, but I'm not going to. Why not? You find it in verse 54, because he is faithful to the end. How else then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it has to happen this way? How else could the scripture be fulfilled if I don't live up to what's expected of me? How can I be faithful if I run away from the conflict? How is it? He can't be. He can't be. He has to go through it. And so here's his answer in verse 53 is that he can give up and call on God and call the angel armies down and get out of the situation. He can give up and quit. Or he can stay strong and go to the work that he needs to do to not give up. And in this case, giving up is what looks like fighting back. Right? Giving up for Jesus is not just going along with everything that the people are going to do to him. It's not just giving up and quitting and letting them abuse his body. That's not giving up. That is the most action that Jesus can take in this story. Giving up looks like getting out of the problem that God's putting him into. Giving up looks like getting out of the sacrifice that God's making. Giving up means quitting on God's plan. And persevering and being patient and long-suffering through it all looks like obeying God's plan. Our version of giving up is what the disciples saw Jesus doing. Right? Our version of giving up is when people just quit and they don't put forth any effort, and somebody's doing something bad to you. Oh, I'm going to just give up and let them do it. That's our version of giving up. That's what the disciples were doing, but actually the disciples were giving up. Trusting in strength, not in God's plan. Trusting in the might of armies and not in God. They're trusting in themselves and their strength and their ability to deliver and not in God. Jesus could call an army if he wanted to. But that's called giving up, because that would be quitting out of God's plan for him. And so he doesn't fight back, but he stays faithful until the end. And unfortunately, what you have at the end of this story is you have two counts of hypocrisy that happen in verses 55 and 56. Two counts of hypocrisy. In verse 55, at that time, Jesus said to the crowds, all of the people who are around, all of this mob who's come out. Guess what he says? He says, have you come out with swords and clubs like I was a criminal? Are you coming to capture me? I used to sit in the temple every single day. I'm sitting and teaching, and you didn't arrest me. Why not? Why not? It's implied. This is a charge of hypocrisy against these people. Why? Well, it's implied that the Pharisees, the Pharisees being the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, chief priests, elders, the scribes, the whatever you want to call them, they are all about preserving their own image. They're all about preserving what they think is right. They are all about doing their own thing and looking really good for the crowds. And so Jesus is sitting in the temple. If they actually disagreed with what he was teaching, why not hold him to account for it? If they can actually contradict his words, why not hold them to account? Why not testify against him? Why not defeat him in an intellectual argument? Why not bring up some secret truth of Scripture that was there the whole time and Jesus just didn't see it? If he's wrong, they could just defeat him while he's in the temple. But he's not. And they know he's not, but they want to keep looking good. They want to keep being powerful. They want to keep being in charge. And so instead of admitting that Jesus is who he says he is, what do the Pharisees, the chief priests, the elders, the scribes, what do they decide to do? We're going to form a mob, and we're going to arrest him in the dark outside of the city where nobody's there to kind of uproar and cause a mob in return. Nobody's there to uproar and create this big disaster situation. We'll kill him while it's quiet. We'll take him out as sneakily as we can and minimize the effects of bad publicity. That's what they're thinking about. Not their goodness, not who's right, not, and in fact, it's actually anti who's right. They're not thinking about who is godly in this situation. They are thinking about how they're going to be perceived by other people. And that's the first count of hypocrisy that Jesus calls out. You're all about preserving your own image. You're all about being impressive. Why? Why don't you fix the inner man? Why don't you fix who you are? Why don't you fix the things that you're doing and the thoughts you have and your heart problems? Why don't you just align yourself with God and then do his actions? But they don't. They're not interested in that. They're interested in themselves. And so they wait till it's dark and it's quiet and it's out of the city on a random mountainside, and they get a few people together to go and grab him and pull him back to have a trial in the middle of the night, which is, by the way, illegal. They're going to have a secret, covert trial so that they can get him convicted and sentenced, hopefully before anyone knows what's happening. That's the plot of the Jewish leaders. And it's going to work. But that's not a good thing for them. But that's only one count of hypocrisy. And that's the typical one. That's the expected one. That's the one we know because, the Pharisees are just bad. We've kind of seen that theme over and over and over again. But here's the really sad one. It's in verse 56. When Jesus is speaking to the crowds, he says, I was in the temple. You could have grabbed me anytime you wanted to, but you didn't. But all this happened so that the writings of the prophets would be fulfilled. And then what happens is that all the disciples deserted him and ran away. What a mess. What a mess this is. Because it's not like we can just condemn all the Pharisees for being bad, but all of God's people are good. It's not that we can condemn the Jewish leaders for being bad, but the disciples are really good and faithful. No, as much as the Pharisees are all about preserving their image and like their power and such, the disciples are also just about preserving their own lives. The disciples are purely about preserving themselves and their own lives. Well, what are they doing? They're running away. They're not willing to stand with Jesus. They're not willing to stand for truth to support their teacher. They're not willing to be faithful to this man. They all promised they would be, and now they're not. It's not just Judas who betrays Jesus. It's all of them. As they all quit out, they decide they're more into keeping themselves alive than they are into supporting Jesus, the Son of God. God himself on earth. They give up. They're no better than the Pharisees are. And honestly, are we? Are we any better than the Jewish leaders were? We see something that we don't like about God. We see that he says something, and we really wish that weren't there. Our society wants us to accept these three things, and yet God says don't. What do we do? We could just ignore God's rules. We do the same thing. You see churches all over the place doing the same thing as they ignore the rules of God to find new and alternative interpretations to old texts that say the same thing they always have said. That certain things, certain actions, certain behaviors are wrong, and yet people just excuse them. Why? Because they're doing the same thing. The same thing the Pharisees were doing, the same thing the disciples were doing. They're not willing to stand with Jesus. When the going gets tough, they quit out. When the going gets tough, they give up. So the question is, really, who are you going to emulate? It comes down to this here at the end. Are you like Jesus? Are you the Jesus who is faithful to the end? Are you the Jesus who will not fight back because he knows it'll just prolong the problem, because he knows he'll actually win and get out of it, and that just means he messes up everything? Are you the Jesus, or are you like Jesus who could feasibly quit, whatever that looks like in your situation? You could quit following God, and yet you won't? Or are you the Pharisees who feasibly could start following God and yet you won't? Or are you the disciples who could keep following God and yet they don't? Unfortunate truth that everyone has to grapple with on their own. I can't answer this for you. I can only answer it for me. Who are you? Are you going to be like Jesus? Are you going to be the Pharisees? Are you going to be the disciples? One of those is good. And the Pharisees and the disciples both miss what they're going for. Basically, what we see in Jesus's betrayal is a question: who are you going to hold to? Are you going to hold to God, or are you not? Are you going to be like God, or are you not? Are you going to be like Jesus is, or are you not? That's the problem. That's the question. And I can't answer that for you. You have to answer that on your own. Jesus is betrayed by his friend. Some of his other friends offer resistance, but that's foolishness, because that's just going to destroy, that's just going to quit out of the work that God has given for Jesus. And so ultimately his friends run away. They betray him as they promised they would not, but he knew they would. And Jesus is left all alone with nobody else as he's dragged off towards the trial. That's the situation we end off in Matthew 26, in verse 56. And we'll pick up from there next time. Hopefully, this is helpful to you. Hopefully, there's something here that's valuable, that's good information or good application, something that you can take and use and benefit from. That's what we're going for here. If you're watching the video, I have a brief outline of this laid out. It's not great, and I don't even know how well you could read it, but it's an option if that is maybe helpful. The purple is things that are from the text itself. The blue is kind of my input on those things, and so if that's something you're interested in, by all means, check it out. And there should be a YouTube video going up at about the same time that the audio goes up on Spotify and wherever else it goes, because I don't even know. We're getting near the end. One day we will finish this book of Matthew. One day, but not yet. And so hopefully that'll be good and helpful for you and for me to be able to get through this, have a good understanding of it, and be able to solidly understand and overview this book. This has been going on for quite a while. How many years has this been going on? Is it only a year and a half? Only a year and a half. I think this is episode 87 of the series, I think. So maybe we'll get done by episode 100. But whatever the case, Matthew is a wonderful book that deserves a lot more attention than I'm even giving it. So go and read it on your own, and please, please do, because it's just wonderful. And nothing beats a simple reading of the text. Remember, I may as well repeat this because I haven't said it in a long time. This series is called Biblical Breadcrumbs because it's not, the book itself. It's not the actual substance. It's just little bits and pieces of it. So go read the book. If my commentary on it is helpful, cool, and I'm glad. And I'm glad that inspires you to go and read the book. But if your survey of this text stops with my interpretation and brief commentary on some of the aspects of it, if you stop there and don't read the actual text like several times over, you're missing the point. So by all means, use this as a helpful resource, but please remember where the bread actually comes from. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed. I hope that's helpful and that's something beneficial to you. If it is, let me know. I would be glad to. I am glad to continue it, and I hope that this is something that is beneficial as we move into the last few chapters of Matthew and the wrap up and the climax of the story. It's coming, and we're kind of in the front stages of it, and we'll figure out the rest of where the story is going within the next few or the next several weeks, next couple of months. We'll be finishing up this book. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you benefited, and I'll see you on the next episode of Biblical Breadcrumbs.